This is one of a series of Good Answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. Archaeology is, like medicine, both a science and an art. As such, it requires skill, patience, attention to subtle detail, and a degree of humility. Humility? Yes, because you must always remember that despite your best efforts, you may have missed something. Of course, in medicine, such an error can be disastrous. In archaeology, more like embarrassing. Today, we'll see an instance where someone looked over Harvard's shoulder and came up with some pretty valuable observations. It all goes back to when an archaeological expedition from Harvard University went to Israel in 1908. Their choice for a dig site was Samaria, that is, the ancient capital city of Israel in the 9th century BC and following. There was a lot to find, since the site had been inhabited for centuries as succeeding kings reworked and expanded it. The team dug for 3 seasons and then, as responsible archaeologists do, eventually brought out and published the formal report of their findings. They reported having found the palaces of Omri and Ahab, and much more. And that was that. For well over half a century, the site stood neglected. All finished. And then came Dr. Norma Franklin. But before we get to her, we'll need a little background on what one might find at Samaria. Remember your Israeli king lists? We all know that after the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam took some really bad advice on how to handle his people, threatening to be much more demanding than his father had been. And so 10 tribes walked out, and under Jeroboam formed the northern kingdom of Israel, leaving Rehoboam to govern Judah. Jeroboam also made some bad choices, especially in authorizing altars and golden calves to be set up for worship. But Israel's first capital was not at Samaria, but at Shechem, and then at the nearby Tirzah. And Jeroboam's successors reigned there, one after the other, for some 50 years: Nadab, Baasha, Elah, and Zimri. And after a series of assassinations, Omri came to the throne. Some 6 years at Tirzah apparently made him confident enough to proclaim peace and security and build a new capital to the west at Samaria. He was followed there by his son, the notorious Ahab, and his grandson Ahaziah, and more. Now, about that move to Samaria. 1 Kings 16 tells us, quote, Omri reigned in Tirzah for 6 years. Then he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. He built on the hill and named that town which he built Samaria, after Shemer, the owner of the hill. It was here that the Harvard team went to dig for Omri's palace. But Samaria continued to be inhabited long after Omri, and even after the collapse of the northern kingdom. It was a huge site, with much to be found there from the later centuries. Roman period remains were evident everywhere, many of them from projects that Herod the Great had developed. There was a theater, still well preserved, a Roman-type forum, and a monument to Caesar Augustus, an Augusteum, or in Greek, a Sebasteum. Herod had even renamed the place Sebaste. Under all that, or even intermingled with it, were the remains of the old kingdom of Israel. And the Harvard people, knowing that Omri's palace should be the first major structure on the hill, dug all the way down to bedrock. And it turned out that the bedrock itself was interesting. It was full of man-made holes. Some of them were rather large around, but shallow, easily identified as pits for treading grapes. Others were deep, like cisterns, likely intended for storage of oil or wine. In cross-section, they were almost bottle-shaped. So there had been something there before. Recall that Omri bought the hill for 2 talents of silver. Looks like he got a bargain, because the previous owner had a big business going there, and Omri's palace would be built right on top of it. The Harvard folks eventually published their findings, and that's where things stood until Norma Franklin came along. She had some questions about the site and began her own dig, not in Israel, but in the basement of the Harvard Semitic Museum. Why there? The general public may assume that archaeologists spend all their time digging or teaching classes, but in fact, they do a lot of homework. It is beyond foolhardy to start work on a site without researching its background, and especially what others have found there. What she found in the library of the museum led her eventually to Israel and the site of Samaria, because something in the Harvard report seemed odd. One of the site drawings Harvard had produced showed a feature labeled Cistern 7, here in green. But another drawing, done in cross-section, showed apparently the same feature, but labeled Tomb 7, ? It was not clear whether these were actually the same feature or 2 different ones. In the latter case, then the plan should look like this. That was enough to start the lady thinking, and then booking travel for Israel. Now, she didn't have authorization to dig at this time, but she could explore. Walking over the site and comparing it with the Harvard plans, she soon discovered that there were indeed 2 features, neither one a cistern, 2 tombs. One is directly under the palace courtyard. It's rectangular, 16 feet by 19 by 11 feet high. There is an entrance tunnel 18 feet long and high enough to walk through. One can tell that this one was dug before the palace was finished, because the part under the courtyard was originally dug as a trench and then roofed over with slabs to form the floor of the courtyard. The second tomb is under a large room of the palace, just a bit south of the courtyard. It is almost identical in dimensions to the first, but with a longer entrance tunnel, as the topography required. Evidence shows it was built a few years later, tunneled in under the palace floor. So a small irregularity in Harvard's site plans led Dr. Franklin to a major discovery. There was nothing to be found in the tombs, since, like most ancient tombs, they would have been looted in antiquity. But Dr. Franklin makes a compelling case that they are the tombs of King Omri, which he would have built for himself when he built the palace, and, very likely, of his successor, King Ahab. Here we see her, beside the entrances of the two tombs. Those of us who have only visited modern American cemeteries may find it curious that a king would want to be buried in this way, but the practice was very common in antiquity, and it has continued in various forms down to today. With the advent of Christianity, burial in churches was considered a high honor. Here's a knight whose sarcophagus is inscribed in Latin, "To contend for homeland, for children, for altars, for one's own." And here, in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, is the tomb of the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. As for kings, some 30 monarchs have been buried in Westminster Abbey in London. Well, all of us would like to be remembered, I suppose. But for what? Omri and his son Ahab were remembered all right. Almost 200 years later, their names were still a byword, as we see in the book of Micah. In declaring the coming destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria, he named 2 who bore much of the blame for the people's crimes. Quote, "For you have kept the statutes of Omri, and all the works of the house of Ahab, and you have walked in their counsels, that I may make you a desolation, and your inhabitants a hissing, so you shall bear the scorn of my people." Micah 6:16. And Ahab we especially remember for arranging the murder of Naboth for his vineyard, and for when he sought to blame Elijah for the country's famine. Quote, "When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, 'Is it you, you troubler of Israel?' And he answered, 'I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." 1 Kings 18:17-19. Well, we all know how that contest ended, and not to Ahab's credit. And yet, kings always seem to want to be remembered, and so they want their tombs to be in places where later generations will visit and venerate them. But in the cases of Omri and Ahab, we didn't know where they were interred. Well, now we do. And for that, we can thank Norma Franklin. As for the recognition these 2 kings deserve, that we should leave to the King of all kings. If you have questions or comments about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.